The North African desert is not merely a place, it is a monument to time and forgetting. It is an ocean of sand, stone, and silence, where the sun is a cruel god and the wind is a relentless scavenger. For thousands of years, the Sahara and its coastal extensions have claimed empires, armies, and men, swallowing their remnants whole and erasing their tracks with the diligence of an archaeological ghost. During the most brutal years of the Second World War, this sprawling, desolate theater became the proving ground for a new, mechanized kind of conflict. It was a war fought at speed, a war of thrust and parry across vast, featureless plains where the logistics of water and fuel were often more critical than the caliber of the guns. And when the dust settled in 1943, the desert did what it always does, it began to consume the remnants. For decades, the desert kept its secrets. Shell casings corroded, tires crumbled into dust, and the aluminum wings of downed aircraft became shimmering mirages in the heat haze. The relics were there, but finding them was an act of fate, reserved for the few who dared to penetrate the deepest, most treacherous reaches of the interior. The stumble of fate. It was in the early 1980s that a small, independent team of desert explorers, a mix of former military men, geologists, and history enthusiasts, set out into the remote regions west of the Libyan-Egyptian border. They were not searching for treasure or oil, they were searching for the silence of the Great Sand Sea, an area largely untouched since the final, desperate retreat of the Axis forces. Their convoy, consisting of heavily modified four-wheel drive vehicles, battled for days against the punishing terrain, dunes that shifted like liquid, and sebkhas, salt flats that could trap a vehicle in a muddy grave. One sweltering afternoon, after a frustrating day spent digging a jeep out of a soft sand pocket, one of the younger members of the team, scanning the horizon, noticed a strange, rectilinear shape jutting from the lip of a dune. It wasn't a rock formation. The sun, high and blinding, caught the dull sheen of what was undeniably metal. They approached cautiously. The structure was clearly man-made, but mostly submerged. Years of wind and sandblast had scoured the exposed sections down to their raw components. Using shovels and brushes, the team began the grueling process of excavation, peeling back the layers of accumulated geological time. What emerged from the sand was the ghost of a vehicle. A light, armored car, clearly of German origin, its wheels long rotted away but its chassis intact. It lay tilted steeply, as if trying to climb the dune but freezing mid-motion, entombed by the endless tide of sand. The rusted time capsule. The true significance of the find lay not in the vehicle itself, but in its preserved interior. The dry desert air, combined with the quick burial by shifting dunes, had acted as a perfect time capsule. After carefully opening the driver's hatch, the explorers descended into the humid, enclosed air of 1942. The smell, years later, was still faintly discernible, a mix of mildew, gasoline vapors, and old leather. Rusted equipment lay where it had fallen. Canteens, empty ammunition clips, a cracked radio set, and a battered German helmet resting on the floor. But the most critical discovery was made under the co-driver's seat. Wedged into a crevice and covered by a scattering of desiccated ration wrappers, they found a small, canvas satchel. Its fabric had resisted the desert's decay, and inside, protected from the worst moisture, lay a collection of documents. These were not battle reports or personal letters. They were maps. Detailed, hand-annotated maps covered in German script, with precise compass bearings and coded numerical markings. They were a military historian's dream, a direct line of communication from the past. At first, the explorers treated it as just another piece of wartime history, a melancholy relic of the famed Africa Corps. But when the coordinates on the recovered maps were cross-referenced with the vehicle's exact location, the historians brought in to analyze the find realized they had stumbled upon something far more important than a random wreck. This isolated vehicle was not lost. It was, impossibly, in the wrong place. The North African campaign had a distinct and well-documented geography. The fighting was largely confined to the coastal strip, where the port cities of Benghazi, Tobruk, and Alexandria provided the essential link to supply lines across the Mediterranean. The battle lines were a constant, brutal tug-of-war along the Via Balbia, the road connecting these ports, stretching eastward into Egypt toward the ultimate strategic prize, the Suez Canal. All major battles, El Alamein, Gazala, the Crusader offensive, occurred within a relatively narrow operational corridor. General Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was a master of mechanized warfare, but even he was chained to the logistics of his supply chain. His tanks, his infantry, and his crucial reconnaissance vehicles rarely strayed more than a few dozen kilometers south of the coast, simply because the interior desert offered no water, no fuel, and no tactical advantage in fighting the British Eighth Army. Yet, the recovered wreck lay far, impossibly, from this documented corridor. The impossible coordinate. When the location of the German reconnaissance vehicle was plotted onto a modern military map, it sat like a shocking anomaly. It was hundreds of kilometers southwest of any known, continuous German operation line. The wreck was discovered deep inside the Qattara Depression, or perhaps even further south in the most remote section of the Libyan desert, areas that military history had always designated as terra incognita, unusable territory too harsh for sustained mechanized movement. The immediate reaction from military historians was disbelief. Initial theories sought to explain the anomaly using conventional wisdom. The loss theory. The vehicle was part of a patrol that became utterly and disastrously lost in a constant desert sandstorm and simply ran out of fuel before they could find their way back. The desertion theory. The crew, demoralized by defeat, had attempted to desert, driving south in a futile attempt to reach freedom or escape the fighting. The isolated incident theory. The vehicle was perhaps part of a deep-range mission that was never documented, a rogue scouting party whose entire crew perished, leaving no record of their objective. But as the documents recovered from the canvas satchel were painstakingly analyzed and translated, the lost theory evaporated. The maps were too precise, the log entries too meticulous. This was not a lost vehicle, this was a directed mission. The riddle of Rommel's reach. The documents confirmed the vehicle was a SD, KFZ 232 radio-equipped heavy reconnaissance vehicle, a vital piece of Rommel's armored spearhead. Its presence in this impossible location was a direct contradiction to the established understanding of the Afrika Korps operational range. Why would one of Rommel's most valuable scouting assets be wandering alone, hundreds of kilometers from any recorded mission? What intelligence could possibly be worth risking the lives of a highly trained crew and a crucial, irreplaceable vehicle in the middle of a desert wasteland? The area was strategically empty. There were no British supply depots, no troop formations, and no lines of communication to spy upon. The conclusion was inescapable. Something didn't add up. This single, sun-bleached vehicle in the sand suggested that the historians and analysts had fundamentally misunderstood Rommel's strategy. The Desert Fox had been operating not just on the surface of the coastal strip, but in the depths of the hinterland. The wreck was not evidence of a mistake. It was evidence of a secret strategy, a mission so sensitive and so audacious that it had been deliberately wiped from the official record, only to be rediscovered, decades later, by the shifting sands of the Sahara. The historians realized they weren't just looking at a wreck, they were looking at the key to a conspiracy of silence surrounding the true scope of Rommel's genius. The excavation of the SD, KFZ 232 reconnaissance vehicle, once completed, was more than a salvage operation. It was a forensic interrogation of a 70-year-old crime scene. Every rusted hinge, every shattered piece of glass, and every item of personal and military equipment was catalogued with the precision of a jeweler. What the investigators found was a stark contradiction to the vehicle's presumed identity as a simple scouting car. This was a specially configured, long-distance runner, a ghost ship sailing the sand. The standard Afrika Korps reconnaissance patrol, the Aufklärungsabteilung, operated with a limited loadout, enough fuel for a day's movement, enough water for the three-man crew for 48 hours, and standard radio equipment for line-of-sight communication back to a division HQ. Their mission was tactical: find the enemy, report their strength, and retreat. The wreck in the deep desert told a different story. Fuel, the currency of the desert. The first and most immediate anomaly was the sheer volume of extra fuel reserves. The standard 232 carried internal tanks for roughly 100 liters of fuel. This wreck contained not just 2 or 3 jerrycans strapped to the outside, but an additional, custom-built internal bladder and at least 8 heavy-duty, sand-camouflaged fuel drums racked into the rear compartment, severely limiting space for the crew. This was a logistical commitment that screamed of deep penetration. The range extension was not for a day's patrol but for a week's continuous movement. The fuel alone represented a risk, making the vehicle heavy, less agile, and more susceptible to a catastrophic explosion if hit by small arms fire. No sensible commander would burden a reconnaissance vehicle this way unless its mission objective lay far beyond the point of no return. The desert was a greedy accountant, and this vehicle was carrying a staggering ledger of debt. The navigation toolkit. Beyond the compass. The desert environment is vast, featureless, and prone to disorientation. Standard field navigation relied on simple magnetic compasses and the visible terrain of the coastal plain. But hundreds of kilometers into the interior, where the dunes mimic waves and landmarks are swallowed by the haze, magnetic compasses become erratic, corrupted by the iron-rich geology or the simple, circular monotony of the terrain. Found within the commander's position were tools that belonged not in a tank, but on a ship. The sun compass or Sonnenkompass. Unlike a magnetic compass, this German invention relied on the position of the sun in a preset latitude to determine true north. It was unaffected by magnetic anomalies or the vehicle's steel chassis. The discovery of this tool confirmed that the crew was navigating not by magnetic north, but by the solar arc, a level of navigational sophistication essential for deep desert travel, and only ever issued to specialized long-range reconnaissance group (LRRG) units. The sextant and ephemeris tables. Tucked into a waterproof oilcloth, the investigators found a stripped-down sextant, a device used to measure the angle between a celestial object, sun, star, and the horizon. Alongside it were meticulously kept tables of astronomical data. This was celestial navigation. The crew was capable of finding their position by the stars, the method used by ancient mariners, proving they were operating so far from known geography that ground landmarks were utterly irrelevant. This suggested a total operational reliance on highly trained specialists, not just tank drivers. Coded communication and map anomaly. The canvas satchel held the most critical evidence. The maps were standard German General Staff issues, but they were overlaid with annotations that defied normal military practice. Instead of marking enemy positions or minefields, the annotations highlighted water points, specific geological formations or ancient wells marked with W, and a numerical code, indicating potential, and often unreliable, sources of water. Soft sand avoidance. Long, dashed lines indicating large, impassable dune fields or areas of fesh, powder-fine sand that would bog down any wheeled vehicle. Coded rendezvous points. Numerical grids, R47, R52, that did not correspond to any known official map grid. These were clearly pre-arranged operational markers only understood by the launching unit and perhaps a logistics cell far behind the lines. Furthermore, the accompanying notebooks contained radio codes and burst transmissions protocols unlike those used for standard divisional communication. These were likely ultra-short codes designed to transmit a vast amount of intelligence in a few seconds, minimizing the risk of British radio direction finding (DF) teams triangulating their position. The conclusion was unequivocal. This was not a loss or a mistake. This vehicle was a spearhead of a covert desert penetration group, carrying an unusual and specialized payload designed for deep, autonomous survival and high-value intelligence gathering. As historians cross-referenced the coded map annotations with known geology, a hidden geographical pattern emerged. The annotated routes pointedly avoided the well-established caravan tracks, paths the British, relying on their historical knowledge of desert travel, naturally monitored. Instead, the routes charted by the German crew, which historians soon christened Rommel's shadow routes, or Schattenwege shadow ways, were tortuous, risky lines of movement across the very terrain the British considered impassable or strategically negligible. These Schattenwege often hugged the edges of massive geological hazards, such as the northern rim of the Katara Depression. This vast, forbidding basin, dipping below sea level, was rightly considered a natural, impassable barrier by Allied strategists. The British felt safe knowing that Rommel's main force could only move north of it. But Rommel, recognizing that his enemy had discounted this area, sought to turn the depression's rim into a concealed highway. The captured maps revealed a meticulous, almost fanatical attention to detail regarding specific wadis, escarpments, and dune corridors that were difficult to traverse but offered total visual concealment from the air. Bypassing the British eye, this strategy was necessitated by the Allied advantage in air reconnaissance. The British Royal Air Force (RAF) dominated the North African skies, flying daily reconnaissance missions over the coastal strip. Any large Axis movement, a column of tanks, a string of supply trucks, was quickly spotted and bombed. Rommel was desperately trying to maneuver his forces out of the RAF's line of sight. The Schattenwege were designed to achieve three critical objectives. Stealth tank movement. The ability to move elements of the Afrika Korps inland and then swing them back toward the coast, bypassing fortified positions and appearing where they were least expected. The routes, by skirting the depression and utilizing deep wadis, allowed armor to move without casting the telltale shadows visible to high-flying RAF Spitfires. Supply and ammunition repositioning. The Desert War was won by fuel, not bullets. The maps indicated potential hidden supply dumps. Isolated oases or dry riverbeds where German logistics teams could pre-position fuel and water, often camouflaged under dunes or palm fronds. This allowed offensive thrusts to sustain themselves further than the British believed possible. Deep sabotage and intelligence. The wreck's actual mission, historians surmised, was likely the riskiest of all. To scout and perhaps plant monitoring equipment far behind the main British lines, possibly in the deep southern approaches to Egypt, or even to gather intelligence on the British desert outposts like the Free French at Kufra Oasis. The information gathered could have been used to plot a devastating, enveloping flank attack that would have crushed the entire Eighth Army in a single move. The confirmation of genius. The discovery of the wreck offered the first physical, tangible proof of Rommel's secret network. Before this, the notion of Schattenwege existed only as conjecture or unsubstantiated rumor. Historians had always admired Rommel's audacious speed, but they attributed it primarily to brilliant coastal tactics. Now, they understood that Rommel's speed was often the result of undetected movement deep inland. He wasn't just fast, he was invisible. This was the hallmark of a commander who understood that in the desert, geography could be weaponized. While the British dug in along the coast, Rommel was using the vast, empty interior as his tactical playground, turning what his enemies saw as an obstacle into his greatest asset, a secret highway hidden from the enemy's eye. The wreck was not a footnote of history. It was the Rosetta Stone of Rommel's deepest, most operational doctrine, revealing a layer of strategic genius that went far beyond the popular image of the dashing general leading tanks down the main road. The full scale of the plan was now open to analysis, but the question remained: what ultimate, massive objective did Rommel intend to achieve with this audacious, secret network of desert routes? The Desert War was not just fought with the 88mm gun or the Crusader tank, it was fought with pencils and paper inside reinforced bunkers hundreds of miles from the front line. General Erwin Rommel's primary strength lay in his speed, his audacity, and his ability to strike where his enemies were weakest. But the constant shadow hanging over the Afrika Korps was intelligence. The British possessed two overwhelming advantages that neutralized much of Rommel's tactical brilliance. Ultra-intelligence. British codebreakers, operating out of Bletchley Park in England, had cracked the German Enigma machine codes. Though the flow of decrypted intelligence was often sporadic and delayed, the Allies had an unnerving, high-level insight into Axis operational planning and logistics. They knew, often in advance, the strategic goals of the Afrika Korps. Air superiority and reconnaissance. The Royal Air Force (RAF) and the Desert Air Force achieved and maintained near-total dominance of the North African skies. Day after day, reconnaissance aircraft, the fast, unarmed Spitfires and Hurricane equivalents, flew grids over the coastal strip. They photographed every track, every fuel dump, and every convoy movement. For Rommel, moving large formations of armor was like trying to sneak across an open field under a searchlight. The combination of ultra and air superiority meant the British were rarely surprised by where Rommel struck, only how fast he got there. Every German supply convoy was a race against time, desperately trying to unload its precious cargo of fuel and ammunition before the RAF arrived. Rommel knew that until he could neutralize the flow of British information, he would always be one step behind. The strategy of concealment. The great military challenge for Rommel was solving the logistics paradox: how to move enough fuel and water to sustain a flanking attack without alerting the omnipresent British reconnaissance. His solution was to use misdirection and invisibility. The key, Rommel realized, lay not in fighting the British where they expected him, along the coastal road, but in making the vast, empty desert interior his own secret ally. He would use the terrain the British deemed impassable as his private highway. This gave birth to the off-map desert corridors, the Schattenwege or shadow routes. These were not casual tracks. They were meticulously planned routes that connected existing, though sparse, desert features, ancient oases, dry riverbeds, wadis, and specific dune corridors, in patterns that ran perpendicular to the British lines of sight. They were designed to move troops and, critically, pre-position caches of gasoline and water. The flanking mystery solved. For years after the war, historians pored over the battles of North Africa, often marveling at Rommel's supernatural ability to appear where the British were weakest. The Gazala Battle, 1942, Rommel executed the famous Cauldron maneuver, swinging his armor far south and around the British fortifications. The speed and direction of that massive flanking maneuver had always been a logistical puzzle. How did he fuel his entire tank force for such a deep, sustained thrust through an area the British believed was impenetrable? The Schattenwege provided the chilling answer. Rommel had been preparing those routes for months, pre-stocking them with the vital liquid currency of the Desert War. The retreat. Even in defeat, Rommel baffled his pursuers. His retreats were characterized by an uncanny ability to disappear and then reappear miles down the coast, suddenly reinforced. The shadow routes acted as emergency lines of withdrawal and resupply, allowing isolated German units to simply vanish into the desert interior, replenish their tanks at a preset hidden cache, and emerge far down the line, ready to fight again. This secret network allowed Rommel to reposition his units faster than the Allies expected because the British intelligence was looking in the wrong place. Their aerial scouts and codebreakers were focused on the coast, monitoring the main highway. Rommel had moved the war off the map. The wreck in the sand, frozen in time, was the first irrefutable proof that this was not the result of genius improvisation, but of meticulous, long-term, and hidden strategic planning. The mission assigned to the crew of the SD, KFZ 232 was not a glorious charge into enemy lines, but a critical, mundane task that held the fate of a massive armored maneuver in its balance. It was a verification run, the final test of a newly established, high-priority Schattenwege corridor deep in the southern reaches of the desert. The planning was elaborate. The maps found in the satchel indicated the primary mission objectives. Waypoint confirmation. Physically confirm the latitude and longitude of specific geographic features used for celestial navigation, adjusting the sun compass bearings to account for any localized magnetic deviations. Water source assessment. Recheck the ancient wells beer marked on the map, not just for the presence of water, but for its salinity and volume. Rommel's tanks needed thousands of liters of fuel, but the men needed water. An army that dies of thirst is defeated without a fight. Depot security. Locate and verify the security of preset fuel caches. Drums buried under sand are hidden in remote wadis, which had been secretly established by long-range logistics patrols weeks earlier. The crew had to check for tampering, leakage, and British interference. This mission was the difference between a successful flanking maneuver that could win the war, and an entire armored division dying of thirst and fuel starvation in the middle of the desert. Into the labyrinth. The crew, likely a three-man team consisting of a highly experienced desert driver, a specialized radio operator, and a celestial navigator commander, would have set out with the confidence of elite troops. They carried the best equipment, the Sonnenkompass, the specialized fuel, and coded radio keys. Their journey would have taken them far beyond the range of immediate rescue. For days, they followed the tortuous, coded path. They drove through soft sand, across salt flats, and around dune fields, guided only by the arc of the sun and the stars at night. The notes recovered from the wreck, though fragmented, describe a routine of crushing heat, endless rattling of the vehicle, and constant, agonizing fuel calculation. Every drop of water, every liter of fuel was accounted for. The log entries detail the success of the mission, at least initially. R47 beer confirmed, water brackish but potable. Fuel cache 2 intact. The path was open. The final pieces of Rommel's grand flanking puzzle were falling into place. The vanishing act. The exact nature of the vehicle's demise remains a haunting mystery, even with the recovered documents. The notes end abruptly, a final entry scribbled in pencil, vehicle immobilized. Bearing X waiting for retrieval. Why was the vehicle immobilized? Historians speculate on two main theories, both tied to the unforgiving nature of the desert. Mechanical failure. The SD, KFZ 232 was a complex machine, and desert conditions are brutal. Engine blocks warp in the heat, sand infiltrates every bearing, and vibration snaps fragile components. Given the immense load of extra fuel and equipment the vehicle carried, a broken axle, a seized engine, or a catastrophic failure of the cooling system could have left them instantly stranded. The sand trap, the location of the wreck, tilted steeply, suggests the crew may have attempted to crest a large, difficult dune and failed. They could have driven into an unseen pocket of fine, talc-like desert powder, that instantly bogged down the heavy vehicle, rendering it impossible to dig out, particularly if the crew was already weakened by dehydration or exhaustion. The commander's final entry confirms their immediate action. They radioed their position using the coded burst sequence and prepared to wait for a rescue team that would have to travel hundreds of kilometers across uncharted territory. They had water for perhaps a day or two and iron rations for a week. The silent grave the rescue never came. Perhaps the radio burst was too weak, swallowed by the static of the atmosphere. Perhaps the war situation changed, and the precious logistics unit that was supposed to retrieve them was diverted to an emergency closer to the front. Or perhaps, most tragically, the desert shifted. Within days or weeks of the immobilization, a massive Khamsin, a violent desert storm, could have swept through the region. The storm would have erased the vehicle's tracks, buried the immobilized chassis, and obscured the precise navigational markers the rescue team would have relied upon. The crew, stranded deep in the heart of Rommel's secret landscape, faced a silent, inevitable death by thirst and heatstroke. They were not killed by a British bullet, but by the very environment Rommel had sought to weaponize. They had successfully verified the path that could have won the battle, but they paid the ultimate price for the secrecy of their mission. The desert, their silent conspirator, had turned on them, claiming the wreck, the crew, and the secrets of the Schattenweg for decades, until a chance stumble in the sand finally brought Rommel's deepest, hidden strategy back to light. The great struggle of the North African campaign was fundamentally a contest of logistics and information. General Erwin Rommel's success lay not in the size of his army, which was always undersupplied and numerically inferior to the British Eighth Army, but in his ability to manufacture surprise. Time and again, Rommel executed flanking maneuvers and redeployments that baffled his opposite numbers in the Allied command. The recovered wreck, and the Schattenweg it revealed, provided the definitive answer to a historical riddle that had puzzled historians for decades. Why were seasoned Allied commanders, men supported by the world's most advanced intelligence apparatus, consistently caught off guard by the Desert Fox? The simple, profound reason was that Rommel was fighting a war on a different map than his adversaries. The failure of the maps. British military mapping was meticulous, but focused almost entirely on areas of historical and strategic importance: the coastal road, known caravan tracks, and major oases. Their maps were accurate for the regions where they expected to fight. The vast interior, particularly the difficult terrain ringing the Qattara Depression and the deep Libyan desert, was often left blank, labeled with the stark, dismissive designation, practically impassable, or simply, unsurveyed. To the British, this blank space was a natural barrier, a defensive flank secured by geography itself. They relied on the conventional military wisdom that mechanized forces required reliable terrain and known water sources. They assumed Rommel, equally shackled by the logistical demands of tanks, would adhere to the same boundaries. The Schattenweg, however, were roots of non-existence. They were carved into the blank spaces of the British maps. They did not appear on any Allied survey, and because they were new and intentionally ephemeral, they could not be documented by captured Italian colonial maps, which had previously been the Allies' most valuable intelligence source for the interior. The blinders of ultra, even the British advantage of ultra-intelligence, the decrypted German Enigma traffic, could not help them here. Ultra revealed strategic goals. Rommel plans to attack Tobruk on the 26th. But it rarely detailed the granular, operational specifics of how he would get there. The communication about the Schattenweg was likely handled through the most secure and limited channels, handwritten coded messages carried by courier between Rommel's personal staff and the logistics units. The movement orders themselves, referencing coded checkpoints like R47 and R52, would be meaningless to a British analyst unless they possessed the specific German map keys, the very documents found inside the ill-fated reconnaissance vehicle. Without these keys, a decoded message stating, "Move 15th Panzer via R47 rendezvous," would only confirm a coming attack, but provide no warning of the flanking direction. The Allies would be left scanning the coastal corridor while Rommel's armor was already turning the corner hundreds of kilometers away. The absence of evidence. The discovery of the wreck explained another profound historical reality: the absence of surviving German testimony. If the Schattenwege had been a widespread doctrine, surely dozens of captured German soldiers would have mentioned these secret routes. Yet, testimony was scarce because the network was maintained on a need-to-know basis. Only a tiny handful of elite logistics officers, the reconnaissance crews, and Rommel's personal planning staff knew the full network. When the Afrika Korps finally surrendered in 1943, many of the officers with direct knowledge were either killed, captured, or deliberately silenced during debriefing to protect the secret. The reconnaissance crew of the discovered wreck, having perished in the deep desert, took their knowledge to the grave. The wreck, lying untouched for decades, was the only physical witness. It was the material proof that bypassed all the high-level intelligence failures. Till this wreck resurfaced from the desert, the Allied commanders' confusion, their inability to comprehend Rommel's seemingly supernatural appearances, was rationalized away as the chaos of war. Now, the answer was clear. The brilliance of the Desert Fox was not just in his command, but in his creation of an entirely separate theater of operations hidden from his enemy. The rusted metal and sun-bleached documents of the SD, KFZ 232 reconnaissance vehicle provided historians with a missing chapter from the Desert Fox's playbook, a chapter that codified Rommel's philosophy of war: speed and surprise over strength. The vehicle stood as a silent witness to a strategy built not on superior tanks or overwhelming numbers, but on outmaneuvering an enemy who fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield. Rommel recognized that his one constant advantage was the speed of his operational decision-making and the British reliance on fixed, predictable lines of defense. The Schattenwege were the perfect counter to this predictability. This strategy encapsulated the three pillars of Rommel's genius. Fast movement, the blitzkrieg on sand. Rommel's tactics demanded sustained, high-speed movement to maintain the initiative. The discovery of specialized celestial navigation tools and the extreme fuel load proved that his reconnaissance and spearhead units were engineered for uninterrupted desert penetration. They were not meant to scout and return. They were meant to scout, penetrate, and then pivot to attack, relying on pre-positioned logistics to avoid stopping. Surprise attacks the Ghost. By utilizing routes deemed impassable, Rommel achieved the ultimate element of surprise. His forces were not just flanking the enemy, they were emerging from a geographical void. The shock effect of a tank column appearing in a place guaranteed by intelligence to be empty was often enough to shatter an entire British defense line before a single shot was fired. This was psychological warfare waged with geography. Mastery of desert logistics. The engineer, the maps, with their coded water and fuel points, revealed the true depth of Rommel's logistical planning. The legend of Rommel often focuses on his bold leadership, but the wreck revealed the unseen, meticulous work of his engineering staff. They turned the logistical nightmare of the desert into a carefully managed resource, making the impossible movements possible. The desert was not just a stage for battle, it was a complex logistical problem that Rommel solved through meticulous reconnaissance and pre-planning. The value of the wreck. The wreck in the sand, frozen in the act of its final, vital mission, became a microcosm of the entire North African campaign. It was a tragic testament to the brave men who perished, but a priceless clue to the strategy that shaped the Desert War. It was physical evidence, rusted metal, brittle paper, faded ink, that provided a firm foundation for historical analysis that had previously relied on guesswork and anecdotes. It allowed historians to finally understand the operational realities behind the legends. Rommel's speed was not magic, but the result of secret, carefully maintained, off-the-map routes. The sand had preserved more than just an abandoned vehicle. It had preserved a missing chapter in the Desert Fox's playbook, a testament to how ingenuity, secrecy, and a complete mastery of the environment can overcome overwhelming numerical and informational superiority. It reminded the world that in the unforgiving realm of warfare, the greatest discoveries are often made when one looks not at the battles, but at the empty spaces between them. The story of the lost SD, KFZ 232 reconnaissance vehicle, swallowed by the desert near the outer edges of the Qattara Depression, is more than a tale of archaeology, it is the ultimate historical irony. A mission intended to ensure the secrecy of a battlefield maneuver ended up preserving that very secret for over 40 years, only to reveal it to the world in a dramatic, accidental fashion. Today, this wreck is regarded not just as a war relic, but as one of the most important physical clues to Rommel's operational genius. It is the missing link that ties the grand, often inscrutable movements of the Afrika Korps directly to the meticulous, unseen preparation of his staff. The significance of the find transcends the physical machine. It provided the material proof that validated an entire school of thought regarding Rommel's leadership, a school that maintained the Desert Fox was not merely lucky, but that his luck was the carefully cultivated result of superior, clandestine information. The deconstruction of the legend. For decades, the name Rommel was synonymous with audacious, near-reckless bravery. The legend suggested that he simply pushed his men harder, drove his tanks faster, and improvised better than the British. While these qualities were undeniably true, the wreck exposed the underlying, almost mundane truth. Rommel's surprise was the product of process. The Chateauneuf routes were the mechanism that allowed the legend to flourish. They showed that Rommel's strategy was built on exploiting assumptions. The British assumed the desert was an impassable obstacle to the south. Rommel turned that assumption into a military vacuum through which he could maneuver. Meticulous planning, the celestial navigation equipment, the specific annotations for water and fuel, and the coded grid points proved that this was not ad hoc movement. It was a strategy executed with scientific precision. Risk management. Rommel's planners used reconnaissance patrols, like the ill-fated crew of the 232, to take the risk first, confirming the viability of the route before committing thousands of men and tanks to a potential disaster. The wreck stripped away some of the mystique, replacing it with the profound respect due to a military engineer of the highest order. Rommel was not just a general, he was a master of desert logistics, who understood the environment better than any of his contemporaries. The philosophy of the empty space. The most enduring legacy of the Desert Find lies in its philosophical lesson for modern military strategy, the importance of mastering the empty space. In any conflict, commanders naturally focus on areas of contact: the front line, the supply ports, the fortified positions. The T-15 torpedo, discussed in an earlier chapter, sought to weaponize the coastline, a critical contact zone. Rommel, conversely, sought to weaponize the void. He understood that if an enemy's intelligence network relies on observation of the known, the fastest route to victory is through the unknown. The areas the British deemed strategically irrelevant or geographically impossible became Rommel's greatest tactical advantage. This approach, using speed, silent movement, and environmental mastery to outmaneuver an enemy with superior firepower, is a timeless lesson. It demonstrates that the greatest tactical gains are often found not through brute force, but through asymmetric thought, changing the rules of the game to negate the enemy's strength. The single lost vehicle, frozen forever in the deep sands of the Katara approaches, became the ultimate testament to this philosophy. It was a tangible record of a brilliant, highly secretive plan that successfully hid an entire operational doctrine from the largest intelligence network of the war. A secret strategy uncovered. The desert, in its vast, relentless indifference, is the ultimate archivist. It does not judge, nor does it destroy everything equally. It simply claims and keeps. The quick burial of the reconnaissance vehicle, due to a severe Compson or a catastrophic breakdown, was a tragic end for the crew, but a miraculous preservation for history. Had the vehicle been recovered by the British in 1942, or had the crew made it back, the Allies would have immediately adjusted their aerial reconnaissance, surveyed the deep desert, and neutralized the Chateauneuf. Rommel's great advantage would have been lost. Had the desert not covered the wreck so quickly, the sun and wind would have scattered the fragile documents and dissolved the evidence into rust and dust, leaving the mystery of Rommel's flanking maneuvers forever unsolved. Instead, the sand held the vehicle hostage, preserving the critical maps and notes like pages in a hidden military journal. It was only when the desert, after decades of patient labor, finally began to shift and relinquish its prize that the truth emerged. The legacy of the Desert Find is therefore a story of the small and the large. A tiny, three-man reconnaissance car, lost and forgotten, ended up revealing the true strategic scale of the Desert Fox. It taught us that the deepest military secrets are often not guarded by encryption or steel vaults, but by silence in the empty wasteland. The history books have been rewritten, illuminated by the faded ink of a map found in a rusted vehicle hundreds of kilometers from where anyone thought it should be. It was a secret strategy, uncovered only because the desert refused to let it vanish completely, giving the world a final, startling look into the mind of one of history's greatest tactical commanders. The sand had preserved more than a wreck, it had preserved the key to the genius of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel.